Good evening, everyone. Hi. Good evening. I'm Harold Holzer, and I have the privilege of serving as director of Roosevelt House. On behalf of Ann Kirshner, the president of Hunter College, I'm delighted to welcome you, those who ignored the weather forecast. We have dozens and dozens and dozens of people on Zoom who we're also pleased to welcome. And I see the former deputy provost of Hunter College here. So we should all give a hand to Peggy Tershwell, who has rejoined us. She's much more popular than I ever was. So this is the second event in a week inspired by a new book published by the Library of America, which reminds us again what a crucial role they play in the publishing world, assembling compendia of great works and assigning their organization and their editing and their notations to really great editors and serious scholars. I want to welcome Max Rudin, the publisher of Library of America, who is back with us today. Today we welcome one of those great editors who has produced a volume that absolutely transforms our understanding of the literature and the political writing of the colonial era, because it gives voice as well as context to the black writers of that period. Annette Gordon-Reed, who has been at this lectern, called it a record of human perseverance and endurance that offers exhilarating evidence of resistance to the notion that blacks were only to be acted upon or written about by whites. And Skip Gates called it a dazzling rescue mission that fills a gaping hole in the canon of both American history and American literature. Skip said it immediately becomes the essential resource for anyone seeking to understand the fullness of black life in the infancy of our great republic. Amazing testimonials. So this evening, we're not only going to explore this long underappreciated literature, but we're going to hear some of the words themselves spoken by some accomplished performers from the Hunter Theater program, and we're very proud of that. Let me introduce our participants, and they will join us after I'm done with my intros. James Basker has served as president of the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History for years and years. Thanks to the GLI, scholarship of several eras of history have grown exponentially in quality and quantity and outreach in tandem with an ever-expanding volume of work with teachers, students, degree programs, summer seminars. I've been privileged to participate in many enterprises with the GLI. I'm very proud of it. Always making sure that students have access to the theater, by the way, which is why it's such a nice unifying arrangement we have this evening. Gilder Lehrman students get to see Hamilton. Even in the days when it was the toughest ticket in town, those students got to see Hamilton, and it's just transformative, I know. GLI also provides digital and hands-on access to the unparalleled Gilder Lehrman collection of documents and images reposing at the New York Historical Society. So Jim has been a catalyst all these years for a program that has really sustained history education and history educators in this city, state, and around the country. And Susan, our other guest, who I'll introduce more formally in a moment, pointed out upstairs, and it's something I should have realized, in a period when curricula are being contracted and preyed upon for political reasons, the GLI is out there. Not yet can we close down the internet to education, and that's going to be an important resource. I hope not a crucial resource, but an important resource in the future. By the way, Jim is in his spare time, whatever there is, the Richard Gilder Professor of Literary History at Barnard, so he comes at this project both with a historian's eye and a literature expert's eye. And he's written and edited the books Black Historians on the Record and American Anti-Slavery Writings, Colonial Beginnings to Emancipation. So as usual, Max Rudin made the perfect choice for an editor, and that's why the result is so extraordinary and indispensable. So now, more formally, we're also honored to welcome as tonight's interlocutor a very special guest, Susan Fales-Hill, an extraordinary veteran television writer and producer who has worked on such iconic series as The Cosby Show and A Different World, along with a variety of widely praised, widely viewed HBO and Showtime specials, all while writing for the New York Times, Vogue, and many, many other publications. Details, of course, in the program. She has also written novels and produced a memoir, Always Wear Joy, and she worked on the book The Wind at My Back as co-author with the great dancer Misty Copeland. So we're delighted to welcome Susan Fales-Hill. And tonight, the printed program at your seats doubles as a playbill, because we're also welcoming our very special readers. Asia Mahogany is a graduate of the American Academy of Dramatic Arts Company program, and she collaborates often with the Hunter College Theater Department, which is, we think, the finest in the city under the brilliant Greg Mosher and others. And Greg, we thank him, and we thank the Office of the Deputy Dean for the Arts at Hunter for helping us recruit these wonderful people. Asia has done Shakespeare and appeared with Playwrights Horizons and is in rehearsal for a gospel musical called Bruised But Not Broken. So we're delighted that she's here as well. Thank you, Asia. And Elijah Caldwell is here as well. He is an adjunct professor in the Hunter Theater Department who appeared in the ensemble of the award-winning musical A Strange Loop, which earned a special Obie Award. Elijah has performed also at 54 Below, a venue I know well because my 16-year-old grandson is an MC of programs at 54 Below. Also at Town Hall, Birdland, and other venues, and he is a graduate of the NYU Steinhardt School. And nobody's perfect. If you had to go to Steinhardt, I know that's a tough cross to bear, but we are delighted that you're with the Hunter Theater program and delighted to welcome you. So what a treat it is to host this gifted ensemble. Just a reminder, we will have the live program, of course, broadcast to our Zoom audience. You will have an opportunity to ask questions toward the end of the program. And to continue the conversation upstairs, we invite you to the old Roosevelt family dining room for a reception where Jim Basker will undoubtedly be persuaded to sign books. They will be available to you. And it'll be a wonderful celebration all night long. And with that, please welcome Susan Fales-Hill in conversation with Dr. Jim Basker.
Thank you so much for that gracious introduction, and I must add to it that I am a GLI groupie. I religiously watch book breaks, and I see some of the book breaks heroes here. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for braving the elements, although it's not that bad out there. My hair survived. It is such an honor, Jim. I've known you many, many years, but it is such a pleasure to be here to discuss this groundbreaking, paradigm-shifting book. As Harold said in his introduction, it transforms our vision of our country's founding. You have, to echo the title of another historical tome, brought us The Half That's Never Been Told. And in this book are people that those of us who take any interest in history know of, Phyllis Wheatley and Absalom Jones. But then there are 198 other people, many of them we've never heard of before. And they range from Revolutionary War veterans to spies for the Patriots to a hairdresser from Newark. And they write in every form, from epic poetry to pamphlets to sermons to there are a lot of slave narratives that we think of as a 19th century genre. Looming over all of these is the question that still haunts us today. Who gets to be a full American citizen? And Every single text in this volume, and there are hundreds of them, really is a cry, a petition for a recognition of their citizenship and a recognition of their full humanity. As businessman and activist James Fortin from Philadelphia said, "Though our faces are black, yet we are men." Or as my favorite, the hairdresser from Newark said, "God's image, though cut in ebony." So we're going to hear from our wonderful actors. They're going to read. You distilled the bull to a bouillon cube. We have about 5 seminal texts that sort of are emblematic of the whole, but there's so much more. But before we dive into all that, can you tell us about the genesis of the book and what started you on this mission?
Susan, thank you. And I wish I could have you with me everywhere, because that's the best summary introduction to the book. And thank you all for being out on a rainy day to talk about this book. Well, first of all, I'm an 18th centuryist, so I live since graduate school in the world of the 18th century, the Atlantic world broadly, both in the literature and the history of the period. And for probably the last 30 years, I've been very interested in the history of slavery and abolition as an Atlantic world phenomenon. But increasingly at Gilder Lehrman, I've been focused on American history. And when I was researching my last book with Library of America, the one in which they, thanks to Max Rudin and the team, they published as American Anti-Slavery Writings, because I felt that this was an important tradition of American writing that had just been forgotten, that began in 1688 and came along. I found so many texts by black writers that had been completely forgotten. So I'm kind of a field archaeologist who happened across a couple of specimens and thought, well, there's more that I need to look for here. And I began really systematically looking and hiring research assistants to look and canvassing history books and archives. There are about 40 different historical societies and archives that are mentioned at the beginning here because they hold manuscripts and the rest of it. But as the book took shape, I increasingly saw it, and as I shaped my introduction to say, as a refutation of the Dred Scott decision. Because students of history in the room know that when Justice Taney wrote that dreadful decision, which is regarded heretofore as the
and
worst.
it's summed up in the words, "A black man has no rights that a white man is bound to respect."
And he based that statement on a contention completely wrong, that black people were not encompassed under the Declaration of the Constitution. They weren't regarded as part of the body politic. Abraham Lincoln and others leapt forward to object to that view, but he was basically trying to wipe African Americans out of American memory and American citizenship in the 1850s.
It was 1857,
Yeah.
and this was his way of settling the slavery question. So.
Yeah. And by the way, we've resisted the Dred Scott decision and overcoming so many, but we have in some sense acquiesced in his pronouncement, because far too little of the lives of these people or their writings have been published or heeded.
But that's why we're here tonight,
Yes.
because they were having that argument back then. So these people were petitioning for their rights in various different fields: the arts, business, from the pulpit, and through military service. We're going to start, our first voice we're going to hear from is one that is well known to people, the great poet Phillis Wheatley. Please tell us about Phillis and tell us about the selection that we're going to hear.
Well, we're going to hear from Asia in just a minute, a tiny snippet, a few lines of Phillis Wheatley's poem of tribute to George Washington, which many people are startled to hear about, because Wheatley was a prodigy in Boston, a well-known poet and so on. And when the American troubles began, she was an ardent pro-American, pro-independence person. She wrote a poem about the Boston Massacre. She wrote a poem about the Stamp Act. She wrote poems right the way through the Revolutionary War and after, all of them on the American side. So instead of seeing Phillis Wheatley as just the mother of African-American literature, which is a very important place, she's also the poet laureate of the American Revolution. And so I'd like people to hear just a few lines of a kind of booster poem she wrote in honor of George Washington when he assumed command in Boston in 1775, and he begins to take charge of the army that's fighting the Revolutionary War.
He did respond to her, didn't he?
He did. He wrote a letter of thanks, praised her, and invited her to come visit him. You'll have to see that letter to believe it, because I'm sure he never wrote to a black person in that way ever in his life until that moment.
So we are going to invite the lovely Asia Mahogany.
These are some of the very high-flown lines just at the end of this poem in honor of George Washington.
Fixed are the eyes of nations on the scales, for in their hopes Columbia's arm prevails. Anon Britannia droops the pensive head, while round increase the rising hills of dead. Ah! Cruel blindness to Columbia's state. Lament thy thirst of boundless power too late. Proceed, great chief, with virtue on thy side. Thy every action let the goddess guide. A crown, a mansion, and a throne that shine. With gold unfading, Washington, be thine.
Bravo. Beautifully read. So we see in her writing something that we see in a lot of these writings, which is intimacy with classical literature. She was well steeped in it. Deep patriotism, deep religiosity, and a knowledge of current events. So can we talk a little bit about literacy? So to explain, she was taken from what would have been Senegambia, I guess, at the age of 6 and brought to the United States. And she was raised in this family that, owned by this family.
I mean, her childhood is almost unbelievable. She's, we think, 7 years old on the docks in Boston off a slave ship named the Phyllis, actually. And we know from historical records that about 25% of the people on that ship died in the Middle Passage. So she had witnessed at a very tender age horrors. And we know nothing about what happened to her parents, where they were. So the family, the Wheatleys, John and Mary Wheatley, took her in and intended to raise her as a servant. But she proved immediately a prodigy. She learned English within about 14 months. By the age of 11, she was writing poems, which serious New England pastors noted down in their diaries. It was so remarkable. By her early teen years, she was publishing poems in magazines and newspapers around New England. At 19, she puts together a whole volume of poems, which are then sent to London to be published as a book. She has a celebrity tour. All of this in 1773, she's becoming a major poet in the Anglophone world.
And she negotiates her freedom, doesn't she?
Well, that's it. She gets to England just after the Somerset case. It determined that you could not compel a slave to leave England once you'd landed there, and she knew it. And she was greeted and shown around by Granville Sharp and other abolitionists, so she was fully briefed. So before she came back to Boston, she sat down with her master's son, who was accompanying her, and negotiated her manumission. She may be one of the few people ever to manage to do that. She extracted a written promise, which she kept a copy of with a lawyer in London, because she wasn't going to trust
So they didn't
that.
burn it in the cupboard.
And then indeed, when she got back to Boston, she was freed. So she was actually a free woman by the time the revolution was breaking
And
down.
very unusual, because most women were not literate at that point.
No,
And so
she was more literate than 99.9% of the public.
But here's someone who disagreed. So we have to give voice to Thomas Jefferson just for a moment. This is what she was up against, and this was the kind of racialized thinking she was up against. This is from Notes on the State of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson's only book. Misery is often the parent of the most affecting touches in poetry. Among the blacks is misery enough, God knows, but no poetry. Religion indeed has produced a Phyllis Wheatley, but it could not produce a poet. The compositions published under her name are below the dignity of criticism. Is there anything you'd like to say to Mr. Jefferson? One of the most frustrating characters in American history.
Yes. Well, the two things I would say is I'm a student of 18th century literature, and I don't think Thomas Jefferson was at all a qualified critic.
Not if
but-
you read some of what he wrote. I think he was on the claret, the Monticello claret, when he wrote notes
He
on
had,
the state of
he had
Virginia.
a vested interest at this point because he's writing in 1783-84 for a French diplomat. And at this point, he has become a proprietor of a slaveholding country. He is actually rhetorically lined up now to defend a practice about which he had been skeptical or even opposed earlier. But now he's using his considerable brain power to denigrate her because she's, of course, transatlantically famous, and she's a refutation of his racist theories. So he's got to try to take her on.
Exactly. It should also be said that, and we don't have time to get into all of them, but she's part of a coterie of artists. And Jupiter Hammond, who's the first black poet in the country, whose work is quoted here, writes a beautiful epic poem to her. She writes about a painter whom I had never heard of, Prince Dima, who is a wonderful portraitist. What happened to him?
Well, Prince Dima was in a remarkable story. He was a young black man in the Boston area who actually trained as a portrait painter and he'd spent a year as an apprentice to a painter in London, and then he came back to Boston, and in the early 1770s, he was making a living as a portrait painter, and at least 3 of his paintings survive, including 1 here at the Met, and 2 up in the Hingham Historical Society. But then the war broke out, and this very promising young man then became a soldier in the American Army. He was stationed in Boston in an artillery company.
As about 8,000, you estimate, served on the Patriot side.
And he died of measles. The document we have in this book is his last will and testament. He knew he was in danger of dying, and he composed a very loving last will and testament, leaving everything that he owned to his mother.
One of the many tragedies described in this book. So, Souls to the Polls. Let's talk about the pastors. You have many of the works of Richard Allen, who's the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Absalom Jones, Prince Hall. But a person who was a revelation is Lemuel Haynes, who is a mixed-race man heading up a white congregation. Please tell us about him.
Well, we're going to hear his voice in a minute from Elijah, but Lemuel Haynes was abandoned as an infant, and then he was mixed race.
His mother was white, which
his mother
is
was
also
white, father black, but abandoned and raised in a white Christian household, very well educated, actually the family consciously training him for the ministry. But he was a young man in the militia at Granville, Massachusetts, when the revolution broke out at Concord and Lexington. So like all the militias in that area, they were called to Cambridge, outside Boston, and he settled in as a soldier there, and he would go on to fight at Ticonderoga as well. But while he was encamped around Boston, he wrote a poem, which is for the first time anthologized here, called The Battle of Lexington, which is not only likely to be based on eyewitness testimony, because he would have arrived within 48 hours of the Battle of Lexington and probably heard from soldiers who were there about it, but it's the first battlefield poem in American history. Not the first black battlefield poem, but it's the first battlefield poem. So
he started a literary tradition.
Yes. And let's forget Paul Revere's Ride and Longfellow, in the next century. I feel that's the poem that we should be in elementary and middle schools looking at as the
And
first
now,
account.
thanks to you, we'll
do it. But Lemuel Haynes goes on. He's remarkable, and we're going to hear in a minute a second text that he wrote very early in his life. In 1776, he responded to the Declaration of Independence by recognizing its value as an intellectual political breakthrough, but then immediately began drafting an essay called Liberty Further Extended, where he used the ideas of the Declaration to push for an end to slavery and racism in 1776. And Elijah, I wonder if you would give us just a taste of that.
So, ladies and gentlemen, Elijah Caldwell reading Lemuel Haynes.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as issued by the Continental Congress. The main proposition which I intend for some brief illustration is this, namely that an African, or in other terms, that a Negro may justly challenge and has undeniable rights to his liberty. Consequently, the practice of slave keeping, which so much abounds in this land, is illicit. Shall a man's color be the decisive criterion whereby to judge his natural right? Or because a man is not of the same color as his neighbor, shall he be deprived of those things that distinguish him from the beasts of the field? Oh, Christianity, how art thou disgraced? How art thou reproached by the vicious practices of those upon whom dost smile? Let us go on to consider the great hardships and sufferings those slaves are put in order to be transported into these plantations. They are generally many hundred slaves put upon a vessel, and they are shackled together 2 by 2. Worse than criminals going to the place of execution. And they are crowded together as close as possible and almost naked. And their sufferings are so great, as I have been credibly informed, that it often carries off 1/3 of them on their passage. Yea, many have put an end to their own lives for very anguish, and some have manifested a disposition to rise in their defense. They have been put to the most cruel tortures and death. And oh, the sorrow, the grief, the distress, and the anguish which attends them.
So if I, Elijah, thank you for that. Samuel Haynes went on, I think he may have composed that piece here in New York because the Army was here when the Declaration was issued.
And who was the audience for this piece?
Well, it survived in manuscript, and I believe it was circulated among his fellow soldiers, but there wasn't an opportunity to publish it because he was in the Army, and he went on to fight at Ticonderoga after the disastrous Battle of New York, and it was not published until the late 20th century in a scholarly article. This is the first book to actually put this essay in an anthology.
It's incredibly powerful, and like many of the essays in the book, it calls out the distance, the gulf between our founding creed and the situation on the ground. It invokes the humanity of Black people. It uses the arguments of natural rights and our God-given right to freedom.
And it touches one of the main takeaways for me from the book. There are at least 6 texts here between 1776 and 1800 that cite the Declaration as a basis for claiming rights. So my view is radically changed. The civil rights movement doesn't begin in the 1960s or in Reconstruction. It begins immediately with the Declaration of Independence.
It's astonishing how they weaponize the Declaration against the powers that be, and also Enlightenment philosophy against them. So also what a stirring evocation, and so beautifully done, of the middle passage, which is also another leitmotif
Which
that
he
runs through a
invoked.
lot of these.
He went on to be a minister in a white congregation in Vermont.
Can we talk about that? Because that's unusual.
Yeah.
It was a
Well,
very segregated time.
I think
for
his
churches.
intelligence and talent just carried him places that are remarkable. He's one of the first, he was the first ordained Christian minister in the North. He was the first Black man to receive an honorary degree from Middlebury. Mm-hmm. And he was the pastor of a church in a white congregation in Vermont for 30 years.
Well, first to do.
Wrote 5,000 sermons, wrote essays in support of the Federalist positions in politics. And the idea that we've lost track of such a man is just incredible.
But now we found it again. So that's a leitmotif as well. We once were lost, but now thanks to you, we're found. Now, just a little tiny segue into a history that's often forgotten. And in fact, when I was talking to Asia before we came here, she said she didn't realize there had been Black loyalists because of the Dunmore Declaration, which invited basically any Black person who wanted their freedom to come and join the British side. There were some who defected. And one such person was Sarah Peters. Can you tell us about her and her husband?
She's one of the saddest stories in the book, but also part of a heroic story. there were probably as many as 20,000 African Americans who at one point or another joined the British and at the end of the war left with them from New York, but also from Savannah and Charleston and other places. Sarah Peters, we don't know much about her early life, but she was married to Thomas Peters, who is a leading soldier who had formerly enslaved man, came as a young adult to Louisiana, then North Carolina, joined Dunmore, fought. By all accounts, he was one of the toughest soldiers in the Black Brigade. Yeah. And he survived the war, married Sarah, and two of them went off to Nova Scotia, where he emerged, probably because of his military prowess, as a major leader of the community. And at one point, of course, Nova Scotia was a tough go, cold climate, bad, rocky ground allocated to the people. They were really struggling for years. So he was the man who managed to get to London from Nova Scotia, from the Black community, to petition the British government to support a flotilla of migrants, to move the Black community to a fresh start in Sierra Leone. And then he came back to Nova Scotia, and he, with John Clarkson, Thomas Clarkson's brother, who was a naval captain, went round and persuaded 1,200, eventually 1,200 African Americans from Nova Scotia to get on these ships and move to Sierra Leone. So he was instrumental in every way for this great migration, which led to really the populating.
And we should just highlight that this Back to Africa movement was Black generated.
Yes.
Later, under Monroe, it becomes more of a let's export the problem.
Yeah.
It's not Black driven.
Yeah.
But a lot of these
Appropriated
people
the whole
were
idea.
actually from Africa, and they remembered it because they were taken.
By the 19th century, whites had appropriated the idea politically convenient to. But when Thomas and Sarah Peters had 7 children when they arrived in Sierra Leone, and he was, a leader of this whole community and a big advocate in the face of the white administrators on behalf of the Black settlers. And then about 60 days after they arrived in Sierra Leone, he grew ill and died. And poor Sarah, whom we're going to hear in just a second, was suddenly bereft. This great man who'd been her partner, she's left with 7 children who, it turns out, the day that Thomas died, the 7 children were all sick. And the one document from her life that survives is a letter, very brief, that she wrote the day that Thomas died, I believe with his body still lying in the room, because she's writing to the colonial authorities, the white authorities in charge of the storehouse of the colony, to ask for some linen to make a shroud, and some liquor so that she can properly entertain the mourners when they come. So Asia, if you would.
The words of Sarah Peters.
Sir, Freetown, June 25th, 1792. This is to beg the favor of you to let me have a gallon of wine, 1 gallon of porter and ½ gallon of rum, 2 pounds candles, 5 yards of white linen. My husband is dead and I am in great distress. I apply for the above things. My children is all sick. My distress is not to be equaled. I remain afflicted. Sarah Peters.
So that piece is representative of so many in the book that opens a window into a life for just a brief moment. And then we don't know what happened thereafter. I'm hopeful that there are people alive today in Sierra Leone who are descendants of
With 7
Sarah.
children, there's a
Yes.
chance. So,
But we don't know.
Another female voice that we're going to hear from is Patty Gibson. And this piece speaks to the precarity of, well, actually, she's not the precarity of freedom because she wasn't in freedom. Can you set up the story of Patty Gibson for us?
So Patty Gibson is an enslaved woman in a coastal county of North Carolina in the 1790s. And the letter that survives, we found in an archive in the Pennsylvania Historical Society in manuscript. And actually her handwriting is so striking that we reproduced it in the book so that people could see she was actually an educated woman, obviously had quite a nice hand. But when you hear her letter, she's writing to her husband in Philadelphia, and as you listen to her calm tone, you'll realize there's a crisis looming, a dreadful crisis, because she had tried to escape, been caught, and she's about to be put up in the sale, and she has only a few weeks to try to find help from her husband in Philadelphia. Would you, Asia?
Pasquotank County, November 10th, 1797. Dear husband, I now take this opportunity to inform you that I am well at this time and hope this will find you the same. I should be very glad if you will come and fetch me some money by the 1st of January, as I expect to be sold then. And if you could help me to some money, you will much oblige me, as I have set off once, but got caught and brought back and put on sale. I hope you will try and do the best for me you can, as I want to see you very much. Remember me to all my friends, and I remain your ever and assured wife and well-wisher to this day, Patty Gibson.
So again, a window opens, we are plunged into an incredibly dramatic and potentially painful life. We don't know for sure what happened. But I used some contextual analysis to surmise, because her letter was found in a collection of abolitionist papers. I don't think you save the letter unless she survived. Also in that same collection are other letters mentioning several male members of a Gibson family who were there in Philadelphia. So I think she had family there. I think we have a lot of circumstantial evidence that people would have rallied and brought her out. But we don't know for sure. There are so many lives in this volume that deserve to be further explored and completed somehow, brought to resolution.
One of them was Jane Coggeshall, who served as a spy for the Patriots. She was a laundress who spied. So the women in the book are incredible.
Yes.
In the interest of getting us to our Q&A, I'm going to move us along to
Sure.
the next section, which is what I would call men of talent speaking truth to power. There are many men in this book who are James Fortin, who had a sail-making business, the Cuffey brothers, who are petitioning for a lowering of poll taxes and saying, hey, if you don't want us to be impoverished and living off of the state, ease up on us here. But there's this extraordinary letter sent by Benjamin Banneker to Thomas Jefferson. Please give us the context.
So Benjamin Banneker is a free black man in Maryland, largely self-taught, but kind of a mathematical and scientific genius, famously produced almanacs for several years, also solved various mathematical problems, investigated various agricultural issues, and even things about insect life. And he was part of the team that surveyed the District of Columbia to lay out the Capitol. So, I mean, talk about a founder. There he is. But by 1791, he had taken a turn and he decided to make a political statement. And he was largely a scientist, and he communed with a lot of affluent Quakers who discussed scientific ideas. He decided in 1791 to write to Thomas Jefferson, and in very diplomatic but forceful language, called him out for the hypocrisy of writing the Declaration of Independence, claiming all men are created equal, and then practicing slavery and continuing to hold enslaved people.
And he enclosed his latest almanac in that,
Yes.
did he not?
Yes.
So please, Elijah, give us the words of Benjamin Banneker.
This, sir, was a time when you clearly saw into the injustice of state of slavery, in which you had just apprehensions of the horrors of its condition. It was now your abhorrence, therefore, thereof was so excited that you publicly held forth this true and invaluable doctrine, which is worthy to be recorded and remembered in all succeeding ages. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But, sir, how pitiable is it to reflect that although you are so fully convinced of your benevolence of the Father of mankind, and of his equal and impartial distribution of these rights and privileges which he hath conferred upon them, that you should at the same time counteract his mercies in detaining by fraud and violence so numerous a part of my brethren, undergrown in captivity and cruel oppression, that you should at this time be found guilty of that most criminal act which you professedly detested in others with respect to yourself.
Bravo. I have to read Jefferson's response to Banneker. Nobody wishes more than I do to see such proofs as you exhibit that nature has given to our black brethren talents equal to those of other colors of men, and that the appearance of a want of them is due only to the degraded condition of their existence. And then he goes on to say, of course I want to rectify this situation. So, but then after Banneker died, he said, I don't think he really came up with all those scientific theories and almanacs himself. So there's kind of another
Jefferson.
leitmotif going.
If you're like me, the longer you study Jefferson and Washington, the more they diverge as people. Jefferson does not ever finally redeem himself. Whereas Washington had begun, by the 1780s, had begun to write letters to fellow Virginians calling for the abolition of slavery, and in his will freed all the slaves that he owned.
Well, he wasn't broke like Jefferson.
Well,
when
he was
died,
not
so
broke, but
that
he had
helped.
also changed his mind. He wrote a letter to Phyllis Wheatley that you can't imagine, as you indicated, Jefferson ever doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So for our final text, we have the petitioners. There are many exquisite petitions in this, but you selected to read it's the second ever petition by a group of black people to Congress.
Yeah.
Would you please set the stage for that?
Well, a quarter of the texts in this book, to give the lie to the supposed absence of black people from public life, a quarter of the texts in this book are petitions signed by groups of people and presented to state legislatures, to courts, and in 2 instances to the U.S. Congress. But the petition, in a way, I had to choose one. The petition that's most dramatic to me, because it also represents arguably the worst lost opportunity in American history, is one in December 1799, signed by 71 African Americans in Philadelphia. What is moving, and again we reproduce the page of their signatures because 20 of these men were literate and could sign their names. The other 51 wanted their names on that petition so badly that they put their X and a clerk filled in their name around it, which is an astonishing thing when you think about many of them are probably recently escaped fugitives, technically, perhaps in some peril, stepping forward courageously in the same town where Congress meets to sign this petition calling for an end to slavery and equal rights for black people.
And to your point about fugitives, anyone could be snatched at any time from the streets of Boston, whether they were free or not, and hauled off to a slave ship. So
this was a brave petition without question. Would you, Elijah?
Elijah?
Just a tiny excerpt.
In the Constitution, in the Fugitive Bill, no mention is made of black people or slaves. Therefore, in the Bill of Rights or the Declaration of Congress, are there any validity? We beseech that we are men. We may be admitted to partake in the liberties and unalienable rights therein held forth, firmly believing that the extending of justice and equity to all classes would be a means of drawing down the blessing of heaven upon this land, for the peace and prosperity of which, and the real happiness of every member of the community, we fervently pray.
So that petition is very dramatic for a lot of reasons. It was actually put on the table and taken to the floor of Congress, and for 2 days it was debated. It was introduced in Congress by Congressman Thatcher from Massachusetts, which even in the 1790s was one of the leading liberal states on the issue of slavery. And it was debated for 2 days, but the record shows that most of the debate was excoriation by slaveholding states representatives from South Carolina and Georgia. They invoked the French Revolution and the Bloody Terror, and Haiti, of course, the revolution there.
That it just happened.
And just straight racist remarks about who would want to see black men in Congress and so on. And so at the end of that 2-day debate, they missed, and they voted 85-1 against it. But if you think of where this new country was in the 1790s, where 7 states had passed Emancipation Acts from 1777 in Vermont all the way down to 1790s, the Northwest Territory had been created in 1787, banning slavery, and there would be 5 free states eventually come from it. There was a certain momentum. There was a moment here before the Louisiana Purchase, before all of the dreadful expansion into the South, where Congress could have done something, and they didn't. And as we know, that the 50 or 60 years following with Jefferson's presidency were a disaster.
One of those tragedies of what might have been. What is your hope with this book?
Well, thank you, Susan, for asking that. It's obviously, in a certain way, it's a historical reclamation project, even, you might say, a certain reparations project, to bring these people back to life. I care deeply that these people who might otherwise be forgotten completely are here. And through the index, you can find there are more than 700 people named in these documents for whom we may not have any other record that they lived. So that's important to me. But I also feel about this book, as I've mentioned to you, that it's a kind of call to action. That, where are the monuments to these people? There's no monument in Washington to the black soldiers, 5,000 to 8,000 of whom fought in the Revolution. The first man to die at Valley Forge was a black man. There were black men at every battle of the Revolutionary War. Where are their writings in our textbooks, in our school books? Where are the markers in state capitals, in Charleston, in Boston, all these places where these people lived and contributed to the community? 20% of the population were African American, so they participated fully in the building of the country. How do we remember that and honor that, and how can we see it today? But also a call to action. I want teachers to disseminate and use these texts. I want creative people like Asia and Elijah to be writing screenplays and films and documentaries that will flesh these stories out. Susan, if I could ask you, please.
It's coming. It's coming.
Please.
So.
But I just think that this is only a starting point. And there is so much we need to do to restore these stories and flesh them out. And just think of the implications for our time. If the DAR and the SAR, who are now admitting black descendants of Revolutionary War soldiers.
I was invited to join the DAR.
Yeah.
Yes.
And they have been bringing in black members. But if there were records sufficient to trace it, I estimate there are 5 million African Americans alive today who would be eligible to claim that distinction as being descended from.
Yep.
What would that do to our sense of who comprises America?
Is we the people? Yes. And you've gone a long way to expanding that notion. We're going to open the floor for questions now. We have microphones. Ladies and gentlemen, we are very cognizant of our Zoom audience, so please speak into the microphone. We have a lady right up here, and then behind her, a young lady, this lady in the hat. Sorry to point, but I've been asked to point.
Thank you so much. I'm Michelle Winfield, and I first want to thank you for writing such an outstanding, well, really the presentation, because I'm going to purchase the book. I have not read it yet. But I have a two-part question. One, you talk about Jefferson, and he himself bedded Sally Hemings with many children. But when they went to France, they knew that they could seek their freedom, but they did not. And I do wonder why they did not do that. And the last part is that you just described how it was a memento where they were going from one place and ending slavery. But New York held fast and continued. And why? And then finally, Woody King Jr.'s New Federal Theater has produced some wonderful work of some of the people that you're talking about. And so I'll share that with you as you sign my book.
Well, first of all, the publishers here would be really pleased to hear that you're going to buy the book. Thank you. And of course, I'm happy to sign it. I'll give you my best stab. You know, Annette Gordon-Reed is the person to be talking with about the Hemings family, and one can only imagine. But my imagination, because I think, you know, literary and historical life is about empathy, about trying to imagine. And even though you might be part of the Jefferson household in Paris and know that you could be free, you're in France and all your friends and family are back in Virginia. So, you know, the call of friends and family is so strong. And the sense of loneliness, you know, you walk off into the French countryside and you're free, but who are your people? You know, where are you? So I can only imagine that it was that. I know that it was...
Wasn't she pregnant also?
Yeah.
Sally was pregnant, wasn't she?
Yeah, people can pin that down. But Phyllis Wheatley was in some ways the same. She could have been a free woman in London, but she wanted to go back to Boston. She was very attached to the woman of the household, Miss Susanna Wheatley, who was dying, and she in her letters describes her as a mother figure. So she went back, and in a way that was a disaster for her because she stayed in London. She could have published another book of poems. She had people who supported her. Her book was sold out. She was a celebrity. And then she goes back to Boston, and by accidents of history, you know, the Boston Tea Party happens just a couple of months later, and she's all caught up in politics, and nobody's publishing books of poetry in Boston during the war. And her life, she dies in 1784, just at age 31. So, but these are the things we have to do, is try to understand the emotions of people. New York is an interesting issue because New York is one of the states that passed a gradual Emancipation Act in 1799. But the document in here that's most interesting to me is a young man called William Hamilton. And there were rumors, I think unfounded, they were political attacks on Alexander Hamilton, saying that he was the son of Alexander Hamilton. Most historians doubt that. But William Hamilton was a carpenter and a brilliant guy. When you read his essay, he's very literate, very smart, uses really sophisticated political logic. He writes a letter to John Jay, who's the governor of New York, in 1796, laying out the whole case for why slavery should be abolished and blacks should be equal. I have to believe now, when you see that there's a reason that John Jay, as governor, was willing to sign that bill in 1799. In other words, we start to see the black voices becoming political pressure on the white establishment and on some people who had consciences about it. So part of what these texts do is flesh out the backstory. We've always seen it as white actors passing legislation or voting down bills, but we realized there were black people campaigning and writing and advocating all over the colonies and the new United States. I've lost the thread on the last question.
She didn't have a last question. It was about, because you did New York. Why did it happen late? Why did emancipation happen late in New York?
We'll talk after.
The young lady in blue, the young woman in blue. My daughter doesn't like the word lady. I should remember that for the next generation.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Reem, and first off, like Michaela, Michelle, my apologies. Like Michelle, I thank you guys for doing this. I know it's kind of iffy weather outside, but it's a very interesting topic and much needed in this time. And Mr. Basker, you started off with speaking about how in a more modern setting, like in a time where book bans exist and there are being challenges to education and how GLI is pushing those barriers. How do you see this book specifically? I'm looking at Florida, I'm looking at states in the South. And even though GLI is nonpartisan, where picture books are getting banned for simply mentioning racist topics, introducing kids to ideas that exist in the world. How do you see this book furthering knowledge in areas and in its time period where those challenges exist?
Well, thank you for that question. And I wanted to say I'm 40 years a teacher, classroom teacher, and as Max Ruden knows, I never conceive a book that isn't something to teach with and to use in classrooms. And the Gilder Lehrman Institute has been committed to African American history as central to the American story since literally our founding. Dick Gilder's sister, Peggy, is here, and she knows that the Institute was founded when Dick Gilder heard a lecture about the transatlantic slave trade from David Bryan Davis at Yale and said, I didn't learn this in high school or college. We need to do something about it. He started the Institute, and the first seminar for teachers we had was at Yale on the transatlantic slave trade, and we've done that seminar almost every year since. The first thing we did with this book, I had been using material in it for years, some of this from my files, when we created the Hamilton Education website. We're partners with Hamilton, and we do the program here in New York and nationally online. So, well, we'll get you there. But 13 or 14 of these figures in this book are in the website that the students, the high school students who go to Hamilton, can go to and draw on to create their own original acts. So Phyllis Wheatley and other people who are not in the show, actually, but are historically contemporaneous and involved in the history, have been used by the students to create their pieces. When this book came out in November, we had actually arranged, Library of America and I talked about this, and we had arranged to do, thanks to their printing a separate paperback edition, to put copies of the book in 6,000 schools. And that actually happened at the same moment that this book was coming out for the general public. I'd like to put it in about 90,000 more schools, and anybody in the room would like to help make that happen, let me know. We can talk after. But it's a book, there's something for every teacher here, whether a social studies teacher or a literature teacher or a grade school teacher. There are pieces here that should be part of the collective consciousness of every American.
Yes, the gentleman at the back, and then there's a gentleman over there.
Thank you. What are the names of the two gentlemen on the cover to the left of Miss Wheatley?
Oh, on the book. Oh, they're
Yes.
great. You know Phyllis Wheatley,
Yeah,
of course.
bless you. Yes.
So the two men
gents.
are fantastic, and each has a great story. In the center is Absalom Jones, who was formerly enslaved in Delaware, came as a teenager to Philadelphia, eventually purchased his own freedom and purchased his wife's freedom, and became a minister in the Episcopal Church. He started the Black Episcopal Church in Philadelphia in 1794 and lived well into the 19th century. He was a major community leader, civil rights organizer, really a remarkable figure. And the man on the left is from Virginia, who was an enslaved man called James Armistead, who served under Lafayette during the Revolutionary War. And at Yorktown, James Armistead, posing as just an ordinary kind of slave, passed back and forth over the lines into the British camp and out again. And he would gather information from the British and bring it out to his American commanders, and then at great risk, I mean, imagine if he'd been detected in this, he would go back and he would plant sort of false information. Lafayette was so pleased with his courageous performance, and of course the outcome of the battle, that he advocated to the Virginia legislature to grant James Armistead his freedom. James Armistead was so grateful, he took the name Lafayette And so his name the rest of his life was James Armistead Lafayette. That painting came much later in life. Lafayette made a famous tour back of the United States in 1824 and visited all of the states in the country in a kind of, late life gesture. And when he was in Virginia, he recognized James Armistead Lafayette in the front row of his audience and called him up and embraced him, and they reunited in 1824, and the painting was done just at that time. So he's an amazing American hero, and again, where did we ever tell this story?
Gentleman over here.
Yes, many of the former slaves that went up to Nova Scotia stayed there. As a matter of fact, the majority of them did, and some of them prospered in what was then known as British North America. Were there any writings by men or women who stayed in Nova Scotia and developed these towns, etc., and who were in Canada during that time? Were there any writings by them that you've come across?
So that's a great question, and I'll answer it two ways. There are about a dozen or 14 texts here that are by what were used to be called black loyalists, but these people were not loyalists. They weren't loyal to George III. They were seeking their freedom and courageous enough to go and seize it. So they're black expatriates who become British subjects. And so some of them in this book, who go on to write their life stories, spent time in Nova Scotia and later published in London or from Sierra Leone their life stories. So some of that personal history is captured there. And there are others like John Marrant and other itinerant preachers whose time in Nova Scotia gets captured in their writings. There is a second part of the question is that there are historians in Canada whom I explored as much as I could, but most of the writing they pick up on is in the 19th century as the, what would we call them, Afro-British citizens develop their communities, and some of them become ministers and leave written records and letters and so on. So there are records from the 19th century, but nothing in this book goes past 1800. But there is a rich vein of material, and I think there's a whole association in Canada of historians who focus on the black history of, they're in Ontario as well as Nova Scotia.
I think we have time for one more question, if there is one. Oh, yes, sir. No, because we have to think of our Zoom audience. Hello, Zoom
Absolutely.
audience.
This has been thoroughly fascinating. Thank you all. I'm just curious, was there any material that you came across that was too personal or problematic or lurid or anything that you decided to leave out?
There was a lot of material that had to be left out because there's more than you can imagine. But nothing got left out because it was too graphic or horrible. There are texts in here that are so graphic that they would be really problematic for young children to read. Depictions of whippings that are, if you've ever seen 12 Years a Slave, that's based on an actual slave narrative of the 1850s. And the movie is brutal, but it's very realistic. Well, there are texts here that depict, that are quite graphic in terms of physical violence, but nothing was left out for that reason. And this is important that we have a record and not sterilize it.
Absolutely. Very interesting. Thank you.
Oh, I think we have one more questioner, and then I think we're going to get the hook. We don't want to be kicked out of of Roosevelt House.
Hi, my name is Angelique, and I want to thank you so much for this book and doing the research in Black history. We have such rich stories in our community, and they have to be, there are stories that need to be told, and I thank you for your work. My question is, are you going to continue to do more research and perhaps another follow-up to this book?
There's a market for the volume 2.
Yes. The truth is that the research has begun well into the 19th century, and I think the Library of America is eager to do that volume too. Provisionally, this isn't final because I have files of material. You know, you go everywhere to find the material, but I think the cutoff will be from 1800 to 1845 for two reasons. Frederick Douglass's narrative appears in 1845, and it is such a bestseller and is such a masterpiece of writing. It has a kind of heroic stature in our canon, and we feel like African-American writing began at that point, but it's one marker. And the other is the Mexican-American War, which is an expansionist war pushed by slave state politicians who want to expand the territory for slavery. And I feel that is a certain turning point as well. So from 1800 to 1845, I regard as a kind of early republic in American history. And a lot of voices, far more than in this period, are there in writing. Even just to read William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator, there are black writers up and down that periodical from 1831 on, but so many others. And you know, you feel embarrassed collectively for our predecessors because there apparently was no interest in gathering and preserving these writings. But they're there, so if I live long enough and you're patient, we're going to have that volume.
And I can say this for you. Let's get our friends to buy the book. When the book sells, more follow. Thank you so much, Jim.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harold.